Hey, grade 8s, here is the last chapter for grade 8 social studies, which is chapter 16, Return to the Roots. Now, you guys are probably wondering, return to what roots? And we're going to tell you in this very informative video with me, Mr. Hansen, and Mr. Yeoman.
Yeah. Okay, so change and resistance. So our last chapter, we looked at the beginning of the Meiji period. We looked at how the Meiji period brought a whole bunch of changes. It ended the feudal system. It began industrialization. It tried to westernize the country. So what does westernize mean? It means adopt the Western culture, the Western way of dress, the Western way of interacting with people, the Western style of education, the Western style of business, all things that were foreign to most Japanese people, right? And so the Japanese were actually split on how they felt about all of these changes. Many were happy for the new freedoms and the new things that they could buy. However, many of the traditionalists or the conservatives were opposed to the changes because it meant moving away from the old social structure. It meant doing away with a bunch of the cultural practices that many people liked, okay? The Meiji period is a time of westernization, which means changes from Japanese culture towards a Western culture.
Yeah, so when we talk about westernization, I kind of alluded this to the last video, but we talk about how the clothing even changed, as evident even in this photo, because it looks very Victorian era of dress for the higher classes. So the traditional clothing of wearing loincloths, which I'm not going to get in detail, and towards the pants and shirt style of the Western style was definitely a big difference. Tattooing.
Can I just add to that?
Yeah.
That when you say Victorian style, what we're talking about is in England in the 1800s, in Great Britain, Queen Victoria reigned for like 50 years or 60 years or whatever it was. And so when we refer to the Victorian era, we're talking about Great Britain in the 1800s. And so, yes, you're right. If we look at the way they're dressed here, they are dressed like Europeans. Anyway, sorry, continue.
Nope, that's perfect. Good interjection. I just kind of assume everyone knows about the Victorian era. Anyways, tattooing, which was a very popular tradition back then, was banned. Also, public baths, which were very popular across Japan, that was banned too. There was a lot of banning going on. So basically, a lot of these long-held traditions that Japan used and a lot of cultural practices were basically shunned, thrown to the side, outlawed, because they wanted to create something based on Western ideas, and not everyone was going to be okay with that. That's another thing that kind of gets brushed over is like whenever we talk about how there's a lot of changes happening, it doesn't mean that everyone was all hunky-dory about it. Not everyone was completely for it.
Right, and so then what did the backlash against westernization, what did it look like? The Japanese people were unhappy seeing the emperor favor Westerners and change the culture to suit their desires and preferences. So what does that mean? A lot of Europeans were welcomed into Japan at this point. And the emperor wanted to create a culture in which these Europeans could look up to, that the Europeans would like, mainly because it suited their culture, right? And so this is why the imperial court began dressing like Westerners. Many of the sort of cultural practices were changed to look more like the way that they were done in Europe, okay? However, the Japanese are a proud and independent people, and the government recognized that they may have been moving too fast in changing the country. Okay, many of the regular people were angry about this. Okay, so we know that the Meiji Restoration begins in 1868, and so after about a decade of trying to westernize the country, the emperor and his oligarchs realized that they're going too fast, and so they adopt a new plan. And instead of total westernization, the nation would become Western science, Japanese essence. Basically, they would industrialize while hanging on to their Japanese traditions. It would be industrialization Japanese style.
So, going more into Western science and Japanese essence, it was more of like a balancing act. So, like Mr. Yeoman said, after a decade of basically forcing Japan to be more like European lifestyle, the Western side of things, he decided to change his policy. He was really good at adapting and seeing what's going on. and he decided to strengthen Japanese culture across the country. So it became more of a balancing act, like taking those good things of the European culture, but maintaining the Japanese identity was really important moving forward. So, for example, Shintoism, which was something we mentioned way back at the start of this whole Japan unit, was made the state religion. So it was made the official religion of Japan. A new constitution was created where the emperor's power was sacred and inviolable. Oh my goodness, inviolable. How did I mess that up? Which is meaning that it's unchanging. So again, this is kind of like going back to even with the Shogun era, where the emperor was treated as a descendant of God and was an important figure in Japanese society. And even with like all these changes going on, heck, even like with the western side of the planet, like moving towards, we still have some monarchies, we had more democracies. There was still like a place in the constitution in Japan that said, no, the emperor is still the most sacred person in the entire empire. And so it did a good job of mixing both things. I'm actually going to just continue here, Mr. Yeoman. I'll let you have the next two slides. Next slide. I'm just going to continue with the Western science. So basically, it supported a strong central government with a House of Peers, the oligarchs, and a House of Representatives, which were elected by the people. So again, you still had like some very sweeping changes, especially politically. Like I said in the last video, feudalism is long dead at this point. And you have like some semblance of democracy. Not a complete democracy, but it's a start. Political parties would not be allowed because traditionally, Japanese people did not have differing views about how things should be run.
So another element of this modernization was a strong army, okay? So the Meiji leaders saw that the Western nations had strong militaries and they had control over foreign colonies, right? We think of like Great Britain and how they had colonies around the world, right? And so they wanted to get in that game. And so the government took steps to build a national military. This involved requiring all males to serve 3 years, probably about the age of 18, I would imagine. They would serve 3 years in the military, and they would be on reserve, which means they could be called back to military service for an additional 4 years afterwards. And another element of becoming a strong army was they invited Americans in to the country to help them learn how to create a national military, like a modern military, much like we have in Canada today. Okay. The next step was to take over surrounding island territories. Basically, once you create this huge army, you got to go to war. So, Japan fought a war against China in 1894 and won a decisive victory, capturing islands in the Pacific and parts of Korea. These Japanese victories in the region of the Pacific Ocean worried the Western powers. The Europeans tried to limit the Japanese, but were unsuccessful. So the Europeans have helped the Japanese open up. The Americans have helped them open up and helped them develop this national military. And now they're realizing this might actually be a problem they've created. For example, in 1905, Japan fights a war against Russia over control of parts of northern China. And the Japanese handedly won this battle. This is mostly a naval battle. And so the Japanese are proving to be they're becoming a global power.
Unfortunately, all eras do come to an end, and in 1912, Emperor Meiji died, and his reign was tremendous because it had led an opening up of Japan and made the country into a global powerhouse. This would actually be kind of like a double-edged sword, though, because Japan would become, I'd like to say, a bit power hungry, because they decided they kind of built into that expansionist worldview that was still ongoing, especially leading up to World War I with a lot of colonialism. And Japan figured, well, if we're the best, why not take most of Asia and control it? And it would actually lead to them going to World War II with the United States. So, like I said, Japan did a remarkable turnaround of going from like an isolated country that had a feudal system that was very outdated to rapidly becoming one of the biggest global powers seen up to this point. And the Meiji era did a lot of good for Japan, but unfortunately, with that power became a lot of thirst for conquest, and it would lead them down a path that didn't turn out too great for them at the end of World War II.
Yes, and that concludes this chapter on the Meiji period. And in fact, it kind of concludes all the lecturing we have to do about the Japan unit. So, you've got to finish the parlay now.